The sun hung low and merciless over Copper Bend, a mining town that smelled of dust, sweat, and spilled whiskey. Its single street, little more than a scar cut through the desert, was alive with noise. Boots clattered on the wooden sidewalks. Dogs barked at wagon wheels. An occasional gunshot echoed from the saloon as if to punctuate the evening air. But on this day the attention of the town had been drawn elsewhere, toward the raised wooden platform hammered together at the heart of the square. There, a line of women stood like cattle for slaughter, their bare feet caked with mud, their dresses torn or soiled. A crooked sign dangled from the post above them, reading auction in letters painted so hurriedly that the black streaks dripped like blood. The women's faces told their own stories: fear, anger, hollow resignation. Some stared at the ground, unwilling to meet the eyes of the crowd. Others tried to appear brave, though their trembling betrayed them. The auctioneer was a rotund man with a face flushed from liquor, his greasy hair plastered to his forehead beneath a bowler hat. He waved his hands theatrically, bellowing with the practiced voice of a carnival showman. "Step right up, gentlemen. Don't be shy, don't be slow. Copper Bend has treasures tonight. Treasures you can take home for free." He smacked his lips and gestured to the women as if they were trinkets on a shelf. "A fine collection, some strong, some sweet, some wild. What'll it be, eh? Who's first to claim?" The crowd roared with laughter. Men shoved each other forward, hooting and calling out crude remarks. "I'll take the tall one," shouted a miner who stood still clinging to his beard. "How much for the blonde?" barked another. But the auctioneer only grinned wider, spreading his arms. "Didn't you hear me? Any woman for free. We're clearing the stock. Boys, just step up and make your claim." The atmosphere was grotesque, almost festive, like a fairground twisted by cruelty. Even the children, perched on crates at the edge of the crowd, stared wide-eyed, soaking in the ugliness as if it were spectacle. And then from the edge of that restless mass of bodies, a lone figure stirred. James Holloway had been standing there unnoticed, leaning against a hitching post like another shadow cast by the setting sun. His coat was long and travel-worn, dust clinging to its hem. A wide-brimmed hat hid most of his face, and when he moved, the crowd instinctively gave him space without knowing why. There was something in his bearing, something carved in a way he carried silence, that set him apart from the rest. He did not laugh. He did not cheer. He simply raised one hand. The gesture alone was enough to quiet the voices near him. Conversations faltered, and the ripple of that pause spread outward until the whole street seemed to hold its breath. Dozens of eyes turned to follow the line of his pointing finger. It aimed not at the prettiest woman, nor the youngest, nor the one who had tried to catch his gaze with desperate pleading. It pointed to the figure at the very end of the platform. She was shackled in iron, unlike the others who wore only rope or restraint. Heavy cuffs bit into her wrists, raw with blood, chains clinking as she shifted. Her dress was torn but cleaner than the rest, though the dirt on her face disguised much of her age. Black hair tangled across her shoulders, hiding most of her expression. Yet when the crowd looked closer, when they followed the finger of the stranger, they saw her eyes, and they froze. "Tala, the wild one." Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Not her. Why would he? That one's cursed." Even the auctioneer's practiced grin faltered. He adjusted his bowler hat, coughed into his hand, then laughed nervously. "Well now, sir, that one's, not recommended. She ain't like the others. Caused no small amount of trouble. That one killed 3 men, or so they say." The laughter that followed was uneasy, sharp around the edges. They wanted to dismiss her as a freak, a savage animal not worth the risk. Yet none dared to reach for her, not even for free. Fear clung to her name like smoke. Still, Holloway's hand remained steady. He said nothing. His silence was its own language. Tala's eyes lifted from the dirt. For the first time since her capture, she met someone's gaze head-on. Her stare was unflinching, direct. There was no begging in it, no pleading for mercy. Instead, there was something deeper, hidden beneath the iron weight of despair. A cry no one else could hear, though she uttered not a word. James Holloway heard it. The crowd muttered, shifting uneasily. Some spat in the dust. "He's a fool. She'll cut his throat the first chance she gets." Best let her rot in chains. The auctioneer wiped sweat from his brow and forced another chuckle. Sir, there are easier choices. Any other woman here, and she's yours for the taking. No charge. But this one, you don't want that trouble. Believe me. But Holloway did not lower his hand. Instead, he took one step forward. The boards beneath his boots creaked, loud in the silence. Then another step, and another, until he stood before the platform, close enough to smell the sour whiskey on the auctioneer's breath. His shadow fell across the chain girl. For the first time since the bidding began, the mood of the square shifted. The laughter had died, replaced by an edge of anticipation. Something had just happened that no one quite understood, but everyone felt it. Holloway's hand dropped at last, but his eyes remained fixed on Tala. If there was fear in her, she did not show it. If there was madness, it was a kind the crowd could not comprehend. And in that moment, the whole town of Copper Bend waited, tense and breathless, for what this stranger would do next. Until this day, James Holloway had been nothing more than a shadow drifting across the borderlands, a ghost in the stories whispered by townsfolk and travelers. To the world, he was dead. The newspapers had long since printed his obituary, recounting the grim tale of a young soldier lost in the Red River Massacre, a massacre that had stained the plains red and blackened the reputation of anyone who had worn a uniform. Holloway had survived, but only by vanishing into the wilds, carrying the weight of betrayal like a rifle at his shoulder. He had once been a soldier, proud and disciplined, following orders without question. But orders had a way of turning knives in your back. Colonel Jarrett Monroe, the very man who had commanded him, had accused Holloway of crimes so vile they would ensure his exile from every law-abiding town and settlement for life. The truth had been twisted. Holloway branded a murderer, a traitor, a war criminal. The accusations were false, but what did it matter? In those days, the word of a colonel outweighed the testimony of hundreds. His friends had either died or vanished, afraid to tie themselves to a man whose name was now cursed. Holloway had no one, and in the emptiness of that betrayal, he had found only one certainty: survival. He had wandered for years, carrying the scars of the war on his back and in his mind. The world had shifted under his feet. Territories that had once been quiet and forgiving became wild and lawless. Cities were built and burned, gold was sought and squandered, and men like Holloway faded into myths. He was not looking for redemption. He was not seeking justice. He simply wanted to disappear into the dust and the wind, to move like a shadow that left no footprints behind. Yet the past is a peculiar habit of finding the quietest men. Even as Holloway tried to bury his name, it clung to him, curling around his life like a vine around a fence post. Letters sent to dead addresses, rumors whispered in saloons, sightings reported by fearful settlers. All of it converged toward the man who had chosen the desert and the mountains as his refuge. Holloway had learned to trust no one. Friends became enemies. Allies were illusions. He had built his world in isolation, carrying only a worn rifle, a few pistols, and the weight of memory. Memory was a cruel companion. He remembered the faces of the men he had fought beside, the ones who had survived only to scatter like leaves in the wind. He remembered the screams, the smoke, the chaos of a war that never seemed to end. And he remembered Monroe, always Monroe, standing tall with the cold satisfaction of a man who had destroyed lives to enrich his own. Holloway had sworn he would never let the man see him again, that the colonel's name would fade like ink in the rain. But fate, as always, had other plans. Despite the years in hiding, Holloway had honed his skills. He knew the patterns of the desert, the flow of rivers, and the hiding places that could shield a man from both nature and men. He could read the wind, the sand, and the subtle signs of life around him. A stranger would pass him by without noticing, while Holloway watched in the shadows, every muscle ready, every sense alert. He had become something more than a soldier. He had become a ghost of vengeance, though he had no immediate target, no pressing need for it. He had become a man defined by absence, a legend that had not yet been written. Still, in the quiet moments, when the firelight danced across his face and the night stretched endlessly above him, Holloway felt a gnawing emptiness. The betrayal, the death, the silence, it was all consuming. But that emptiness was also a shield. It allowed him to move unnoticed, to to plan without interference, and to carry within him the memory of what had been taken. And then came Tala, the girl in iron shackles, whose gaze had pierced the wall he had built around himself. For the first time in years, Holloway felt the stirrings of purpose beyond survival. The past had not only shaped him, but had left him with a debt he could not ignore. There were wrongs that needed setting right, and though he had tried to bury the desire for justice beneath layers of anonymity, it would not stay buried. The memory of betrayal and massacre had prepared him for this moment. The shadows he had walked in for so long now gave him the advantage he needed. And as he looked at Tala, he realized that the past, with all its pain and deceit, had led him here, not to disappear, but to act. Holloway's life had been a series of carefully chosen silences and cautious movements. But in that crowded street of Copper Bend, with the clamor of the mob and the auctioneer's bark echoing in his ears, the weight of history pressed on him. It was a history filled with death, deception, and sorrow, but it also made him capable of confronting the world in ways few others could. The man who had been a shadow, the soldier accused falsely and condemned by those he trusted, now stood on the brink of change. And though he did not yet know what awaited him, he understood that some debts could not be ignored, some wrongs could not be left unpunished, and some cries for help could not go unanswered. For James Holloway, the past was never truly behind him, but it had brought him here. And here, on this dusty street, beneath the eyes of a crowd that neither understood nor feared him, the shadow was ready to step into the light. The crowd of Copper Bend pressed forward, shoving and laughing, oblivious to the raw tension mounting on the wooden platform. The women, lined up in a parade of misery, shifted nervously, their eyes darting between the men below and the shackles that confined them. But Tala did not flinch. She did not plead, did not shrink. She stood upright, her hands raw from the iron cuffs that bit into her wrists, her dark hair clinging to the sweat and blood of a lifetime of suffering. James Holloway's eyes were locked on hers. In that gaze, he saw not the defiance the auctioneer warned of, not the wildness the townspeople whispered about, but a hidden cry for help that had been buried beneath years of torment. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a flicker of vulnerability masked by courage. Yet it was enough to pierce the wall Holloway had built around himself. The auctioneer barked, attempting to regain control over the restless crowd. "Step right up, boys. Don't be shy. The wild one's no prize for faint hearts." He smacked the side of the wooden platform for emphasis. 3 men tried their luck, and 3 men are gone. Ha! The crowd roared, some laughing nervously, some exchanging uneasy glances. Even in their mirth, there was a flicker of caution. Tala's reputation had preceded her, and whispers of her past deeds had seeded fear. But Holloway noticed the finer details that no one else saw. The slight quiver in her fingers despite the chains, the way her shoulders tensed and relaxed like a coiled spring ready to uncoil, the sharpness in her eyes that masked exhaustion. She was dangerous, yes, but she was not beyond saving. He understood that fear and rage could become a prison. But even behind the steel cuffs, she had not lost her humanity. "She's trouble," someone muttered in the crowd, a miner leaning against a wagon wheel. "Best leave her be or she'll—" His voice trailed off. No one finished the thought, but they all understood the implied threat. Tala had survived the unthinkable, and her survival had come at the cost of others' lives. But to Holloway, it spoke not of menace, but of resilience. He stepped closer to the platform, the coins in his pouch jingling faintly with each movement. It was a sound that seemed out of place amid the coarse, dusty din of the auction. Holloway was no stranger to crowds, yet he remained a shadow, a figure apart. The men around him jeered, curious and wary of the stranger who dared to fix his gaze on the chained girl. Tala's eyes met his without hesitation. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the 2 of them. The chaos around them, the shouts, the jostling, the clatter of hooves, faded into a muted background. There was recognition in her stare, a silent acknowledgement of understanding. She did not trust easily. She had learned the cost of misplaced trust too well. But something in Holloway's presence, something in the unwavering steadiness of his gaze, spoke of a man who was not here for spectacle or greed. The crowd grew restless, sensing the tension but not its source. Some began to jeer more loudly, testing Holloway. "What's the price, stranger?" one yelled. "You paying or just staring at the wild one like she's a painting?" Others laughed, shaking their heads at the audacity of a lone man in the middle of Copper Bend daring to challenge both the auctioneer and the law of the mob. Yet Holloway did not move his hand from his hip. He did not draw a weapon. He simply studied Tala, letting the moment stretch. She did not look away. Her jaw was set, her expression unreadable to anyone else. But Holloway discerned the subtle signs of someone who had suffered and endured, someone who had been pushed to the edge and still remained unbroken. The auctioneer, sensing the shift, barked louder. "Step up, I say. Don't waste time with shadows. The wild one's no prize for the faint-hearted." He gestured at Tala with exaggerated flourish. "3 men dead. She's got a temper hotter than the desert sun." The crowd tittered nervously. Some men exchanged worried looks, while others leaned in, eager to see how Holloway would respond. The tension was a living thing, crackling through the air, waiting for an outlet. Holloway's hand moved slightly, brushing against the purse of gold at his side. It was a gesture that caught the crowd's attention. None had seen so much clean, shining currency in this dusty, forgotten town. The crowd murmured, curious and wary, but his eyes never left Tala's. In that gaze was a promise. He had come not to judge, not to exploit, but to intervene. Tala's lips parted slightly, just enough for the faintest exhale. A sign, recognition, hope, relief. The chains around her wrists remained unbroken. But for the first time in months, perhaps years, she sensed that someone had seen her, not as a beast, not as a spectacle, not as a prize, but as a person worthy of help. The crowd watched, oblivious of the subtle exchange, yet unsettled by the stranger who had dared to single out the wild one. Holloway's choice was more than instinct. It was calculated, deliberate, and resolute. He understood what no one else did. Tala was not merely a captive to be freed. She was a soul screaming silently for aid, for someone to step forward despite the danger, despite the law, despite the odds. And in that charged silence, Holloway decided he would act, not out of mercy alone, but because he recognized in her a mirror of the lives destroyed by betrayal, violence, and greed. To ignore her would be to betray every principle he had clung to during his years in hiding. He would not be a shadow today. He would not be silent. The chains might bind her body, but they could not shackle the determination in his mind. Tala's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, registering the resolve in Holloway. And somewhere deep inside, a spark of trust, fragile, tentative, but real, flickered to life. In that moment, amidst the laughter and shouts of the crowd, a connection was forged. The wild one, feared by all, had found an ally in the man who had been a shadow, a soldier wronged by history, now stepping forward to defy the injustice that had held her captive. The stage was set. James Holloway stepped closer to the wooden platform, each of his boots pressing into the dusty street with deliberate calm. The crowd of Copper Bend parted instinctively, muttering among themselves as they watched the stranger who had singled out the chained girl. No one moved to stop him, yet all eyes were fixed on his deliberate advance. In one hand, he carried a worn leather purse that clinked faintly with the weight of gold coins. In the other, a small iron key, darkened with age but polished enough to gleam in the dying sunlight. He stopped before the platform and set the purse on the auctioneer's table with a heavy thunk. The sound resonated in the tense silence. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by the sudden hush, and the crowd leaned forward involuntarily, drawn to the gleam of wealth no one had expected to see in this god-forsaken town. The auctioneer froze mid-bark, eyes widening. What is this?" he stammered, sweat running down his temple. The men around him murmured, some sneering, some incredulous. Gold in Copper Bend was rare. Clean gold even rarer. Holloway did not answer. Instead, he fixed his gaze on Tala, her eyes locked on his. There was recognition in that glance, the silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. He lifted the iron key in his hand, letting it catch the light. The crowd shifted nervously. Some laughed, uncertain whether it was a jest, while others frowned, sensing that something more dangerous than money was at play. The auctioneer tried to regain control. "Step up, stranger. You pay your gold or step aside." But his voice had lost its authority. There was a tremor in it now, a hint of fear. Holloway's reputation, or the calm menace in his presence, was enough to silence even the boldest jeers. Without breaking eye contact with Tala, Holloway spoke, his voice low but carrying across the dusty street. "I'm here for her." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The weight of those words hung in the air, heavier than the iron shackles around her wrists. The meaning was unmistakable. She would not leave this place alone, and no force of law or mob would stop him. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. "Who does he think he is?" one man muttered. Another spat in the dirt, shaking his head. "You can't just she's cursed that one." But Holloway ignored them, his eyes unblinking, his stance unwavering. The auctioneer hesitated, glancing at the purse. The gold coins gleamed like sunlight on copper, a promise of wealth but also a warning. Holloway's hand rested on it casually, a subtle reminder that he had both resources and determination. "This is not just money," Holloway said, voice firm. "This is the price of leaving here with what is rightfully hers." The crowd's tension thickened. Some men whispered of debts, of law, of vengeance. Others simply watched, unable to look away from the calm authority that Holloway exuded. Even Tala, her wrist still bound in iron, allowed herself a faint exhale, sensing that help had arrived. With deliberate care, Holloway inserted the key into her shackles. Metal groaned softly, the sound amplified in the quiet that had fallen over the square. The crowd held its collective breath. They had never seen anyone approach her and live to tell the tale. Now a man was about to unlock the chains that had bound her wrists. The cuffs opened with a final, reluctant click. Tala flexed her wrists carefully, testing the freedom. She did not flee. She did not strike. She simply nodded once, ever so slightly, a silent affirmation of trust. Holloway gave nothing away with his expression. His eyes remained vigilant, scanning the crowd, alert for the first sign of danger. But for the moment, nothing moved against them. Then the auctioneer's face contorted in disbelief. You can't just take her," he shouted, slamming a fist onto the table. But Holloway's stance was unyielding. "I can," he said, voice low, precise, carrying the weight of finality. "And I will." The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily. The miners, the gamblers, the rough hands, all waited, unsure whether to intervene or flee. Holloway's calm command, the unspoken threat in his movements, made them hesitate. For the first time, Tala was not alone. For the first time, someone had stepped forward to challenge a world that had condemned her. Holloway glanced at the purse of gold once more, then back at Tala. The coins were not a bribe, not a bargaining chip. They were a declaration. In that gesture, he had communicated more than words ever could. He had the means, the resolve, and the audacity to take action. Tala's eyes flicked to the purse, then back to Holloway. She saw in him something she had not seen in anyone for years. Unwavering purpose, steady hands, and a refusal to be intimidated. And in that moment, a spark of hope lit within her chest. The auctioneer tried one last attempt to assert authority. "You'll regret this. That girl is trouble." But Holloway only shifted his weight, ready, prepared for whatever challenge might come. The key, the purse, the freedom, these were not simply tokens of wealth or leverage. They were instruments of change. And in that quiet, tense instant, the meaning was clear. The world would not dictate Tala's fate any longer. The crowd held its breath as Holloway extended a hand to her. Tala's fingers brushed against his, the gesture brief but significant. The stage had been set. The moment of defiance, of intervention, had arrived. Copper Bend had never seen anything like it, and the stranger with the shadowed face was ready to show that courage, gold, and resolve could overturn even the cruelest designs. The wind whispered through the street, stirring dust into the air, and in that fleeting moment, time seemed to hold its breath along with the town, waiting for the first move that would change everything. The sudden sound of hooves thundered down the dusty street, echoing off the wooden buildings of Copper Bend. Men and women froze mid-step, eyes wide as the dust kicked up around the approaching riders. Holloway's gaze never wavered from Tala, but his instinct sharpened. This was no ordinary interruption. The rhythm of the hooves was too precise, too disciplined. Federal marshals emerged first, their badges glinting in the dying sunlight. Faces stern, eyes scanning the crowd like hawks. They rode with a cold authority, the kind that brooked no argument, no negotiation. One of them dismounted and held up a document, letting the wind flutter the edges. "James Holloway," he announced, voice carrying clearly through the square. "You are wanted for war crimes. Surrender immediately." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some men stepped back, suddenly unsure. Others sneered, assuming the stranger before them could not withstand the law itself. But Holloway's hand rested lightly on the butt of his revolver. He was calm, unshaken, as if he had anticipated this very moment. His eyes flicked briefly to Tala, who stood with quiet defiance, her wrists free, but her spirit still burdened by captivity. Then, appearing behind the marshals, came the true shadow of his past, Colonel Jarrett Monroe. The man was tall and imposing, his polished boots striking the dusty boards with authority. His face, sharp and cruel, was framed by a perfectly trimmed beard, his eyes cold and calculating. Monroe's reputation had preceded him. He was the architect of Holloway's ruin, the man who had falsely accused him of the Red River massacre and profited from a trade in human captives. And now, he stood before Holloway, a living reminder of betrayal, greed, and violence. The crowd stiffened. Some whispered. Some took cautious steps back. They knew Monroe, or at least they had heard the stories. How he enriched himself through misery, how his commands left men dead, women enslaved, and villages burned. And here he was, in Copper Bend, orchestrating what appeared to be a trap. Holloway's mind raced. The federal marshals were not here by coincidence. Monroe had the law behind him, men at his command, and a history of ruthlessness that few could match. But Holloway had survived worse, and he knew the terrain of both the town and the human heart. His stance shifted subtly, ready for the first sign of attack, his senses attuned to the slightest movement. Tala's eyes met his again. She did not speak, yet her silent question was clear. What now? Holloway nodded almost imperceptibly. She would not face this threat alone. Not this time. Monroe's voice rang out, cold and commanding. "Holloway, step down. You are surrounded. Any resistance will be met with force." He gestured to the marshals, who fanned out across the square, creating a tightening net of authority. "Your history is written. There is no escape this time." The auctioneer cowered, unsure whether to flee or remain. Some townsfolk whispered among themselves, debating whether to intervene, yet no one moved. They were caught between fear of Holloway's reputation and Monroe's command. Holloway's hand never left his revolver. His other hand brushed a purse of gold, a reminder of both leverage and purpose. He knew that brute force alone would not win this confrontation. Monroe had allies, authority, and the advantage of legal backing. But Holloway had the element of surprise, knowledge of the terrain, and allies that no one suspected were waiting in the shadows. Monroe's gaze swept over Tala, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "And you brought her here," he said, voice dripping with malice. "The wild one, the girl who destroyed men's lives. Why? To complicate matters." He laughed, but it was a hollow, cruel sound. "You always were predictable. Holloway, you cannot hide from me. Not here. Not now." The marshals shifted uneasily, sensing the tension that crackled between the two men. Holloway's reputation as a soldier and a survivor had preceded him, and even they hesitated to act first. Monroe noticed the hesitation and straightened, attempting to assert dominance. But Holloway had learned to turn desperation into opportunity. His eyes scanned the street, noting the positions of potential cover, the angles of attack, the way the wind carried sound and dust. Monroe's confidence was a veneer, and Holloway intended to exploit it. Tala, her wrists free but her posture still tense, began to move subtly toward him. Holloway's eyes softened just enough to signal trust. They were cornered, yes, but not defeated. The square had transformed into a chessboard. Each movement critical, each second potentially decisive. The town held its breath. Copper Bend had never witnessed such a convergence. The hunted, the betrayer, the law, and the innocent caught between. The first move would set everything into motion. Holloway's fingers tightened around his revolver, ready to act. The stage was no longer a simple auction. It was a battlefield. Monroe's smile did not falter, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a recognition that Holloway had survived before and could do so again. And in that suspended moment, as dust swirled and the sun dipped lower, the truth became clear. Copper Bend had become a trap. Every ally, every witness, every obstacle had been calculated. But Holloway had something Monroe could not anticipate. Resolve tempered by years of survival, a mind sharpened by betrayal, and a commitment to protect the girl in front of him. The tension was unbearable. Muscles tensed, eyes narrowed, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the unspoken question. Who would strike first? Holloway's shadow fell over Tala, his silent promise echoing louder than Monroe's threats. He would not let the past claim her. Not here. Not today. The stage was set, the threat revealed, and the first move in this deadly game of vengeance and justice was imminent. The air in Copper Bend was thick with dust, gunpowder, and tension. Holloway's eyes darted along the street, scanning every shadow, every creaking signpost, every corner where danger might hide. The marshals fanned out, tense and ready, their hands hovering over their revolvers, while Monroe stood at the center, a smug smile masking the calculation in his eyes. But Holloway had long ago learned that appearances were deceptive. What was silent could be lethal, and what was restrained could erupt with force. A single gunshot split the air, the sound echoing like a thunderclap across the empty street. Then another and another, as if the town itself had exhaled its fear. Holloway's dead. Comrades emerged from hiding, men who had survived the Red River Massacre and had waited all these years for the right moment. They moved with precision, covering the street with rifles and pistols, cutting off the marshal's advance. For every man Monroe thought he controlled, Holloway had an equal counter ready, a shadow ready to strike from behind, from above, from anywhere. Tala ducked low, instinctively moving behind Holloway. Her eyes, once filled with despair, now burned with determination. The chains of the past could not bind her spirit any longer. She had hidden documents, evidence of Monroe's crimes, tucked away carefully during her captivity. Now was the time to reveal them. With a subtle nod from Holloway, she stepped forward, pulling the papers from her sleeve. The wind caught them, scattering their contents across the dusty boards of the square, making the truth visible to all who dared to look. Gasps rippled through the marshals and Monroe's men as they glimpsed the proof. Names, transactions, orders signed by Monroe himself, detailing massacres, shipments of captives, and the accumulation of gold from misery. The colonel's eyes narrowed, his confident demeanor faltering. For the first time, Monroe saw that the story he had written in secrecy was now exposed in plain sight, and that the law of the people and his own soldiers might no longer follow blindly. Holloway moved with precision, taking cover behind the auctioneer's table, then rolling into the open with pistols drawn. His shots were measured, non-lethal where possible, disabling Monroe's men without unnecessary bloodshed. The marshals hesitated, their sense of duty clashing with the evidence of Monroe's crimes. The confusion gave Holloway and his allies the edge, and the firefight became a calculated dance rather than a chaotic slaughter. Monroe barked orders, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. Take him down. He's only one man. But Holloway was never just one man. He was years of survival, strategy, and vengeance embodied. His comrades, those presumed dead, struck simultaneously, cutting off escape routes and disarming Monroe's most loyal men. The colonel's plan, so carefully constructed over years, unraveled in minutes. Amid the chaos, Holloway faced Monroe directly. The colonel leveled his pistol, a sneer playing across his lips, but Holloway's eyes were steady. Time seemed to slow as they measured each other. Men who had been bound together by betrayal and bloodshed, now facing the culmination of decades of conflict. With a practice flick, Holloway fired, not to kill, but to disable. The shot shattered Monroe's weapon, sending it clattering across the boards. The colonel's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic as he realized his dominance had ended. Tala stepped forward, holding the scattered documents high. The soldiers who had once obeyed Monroe without question now saw the truth, their loyalty shattered by evidence and the courage of those they had underestimated. "See what he has done," she called out, her voice carrying over the street. "The truth is here. You've been deceived." The final moments were a blur of surrender and revelation. Monroe, surrounded and unarmed, could only stand and watch as his empire of lies crumbled. Holloway did not gloat. He did not revel in the victory. His focus remained on ensuring that the innocent were protected, that Tala was safe, and that justice, long denied, was delivered. As the dust settled, the square of Copper Bend was transformed. The crowd, once jeering and cruel, now looked on with awe and a newfound respect. Holloway's actions had shown that courage, planning, and resolve could overcome the weight of betrayal and tyranny. Tala, her wrists finally free, walked beside him, no longer a captive but an ally, her strength visible in every step. The marshals, now aware of the depth of Monroe's crimes, began processing the evidence, detaining those who had aided the colonel. Monroe himself was taken into custody, bound not by the iron of chains, but by the undeniable proof of his misdeeds. Holloway watched the proceedings silently, a man who had stepped out of the shadows to confront a past that had long haunted him. In that moment, the Red River Massacre, the betrayal, and the years of hiding all converged. Holloway was no longer merely a shadow, a ghost of a soldier presumed dead. He had acted, he had protected, and he had revealed the truth. Tala's courage, combined with the skill and loyalty of those who had survived alongside him, had shifted the balance. Justice, long delayed, had arrived in Copper Bend. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the square. Holloway lowered his pistols, his expression unreadable but calm. Tala, standing beside him, glanced at the town, then back at him. For the first time in years, Holloway felt the weight of the past loosen slightly, replaced by the quiet knowledge that some wrongs could indeed be righted, some debts could be settled, and some cries for help, once ignored, could be answered. Months passed in Copper Bend, yet the town retained a faint memory of the chaos that had erupted on its dusty main street. The marketplace, once a place of crude laughter and cruel spectacle, had grown quieter. Children ran freely, chasing one another between the stalls, and the merchants no longer whispered nervously about auctions or captives. A subtle sense of order had returned, brought not by fear, but by justice. Colonel Jarrett Monroe, now shackled in iron cuffs of his own, was escorted to the courthouse under a heavy guard. The townspeople lined the streets, murmuring among themselves as they observed a man who had long held power through deceit and cruelty reduced to the status of a prisoner. There were no jeers, no taunts, only a solemn acknowledgment that justice had finally prevailed. His once proud sneer had faded, replaced by the pale, resigned expression of a man who could no longer manipulate the world around him. Tala moved through the crowd with a quiet confidence, helping other captives who had been freed during the chaos. She guided them toward their families, embraced those she recognized, and offered words of comfort where her strength could not erase their suffering. Her presence was transformative. Where she went, hope followed. She was no longer the wild one feared by the town, but a symbol of resilience and courage, proof that even the most broken could reclaim their freedom. Holloway walked beside her, his long coat brushing the sun-warmed boards. The years of hiding, the betrayals, and the ghosts of the Red River Massacre no longer weighed him down as they once had. He had faced his past, confronted those who had wronged him, and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. His eyes, once shadowed with grief and mistrust, now held a quiet determination tempered by compassion. The townspeople watched the pair with a mixture of awe and relief. Holloway had been an enigma, a stranger who appeared suddenly, acted decisively, and then became a protector rather than a conqueror. His actions had not been driven by greed or vengeance alone. They had been driven by a sense of right, by the knowledge that the innocent deserved someone to stand in their defense. In the weeks following Monroe's arrest, the courthouse became a place of reckoning. Evidence hidden for years by Tala and exposed by Holloway's intervention led to the prosecution of Monroe's accomplices, both within the military and among the local townspeople who had facilitated the trafficking of captives. The trial was long and thorough, ensuring that justice was comprehensive. Witnesses testified, documents were read aloud, and the story of countless atrocities unfolded in a courtroom that had once been indifferent to human suffering. Through it all, Holloway remained at Tala's side, not as a guardian, not as a master, but as an equal, a partner in the work of restoring order and dignity. The bond forged in the heat of danger had matured into mutual respect and trust. They shared quiet moments between court sessions, walking the now peaceful streets of Copperbend, discussing plans to rebuild not only the lives of those affected by Monroe's crimes, but also the town itself. The sun began to set on a warm afternoon, casting a golden glow over the town. Its light reflected off the clean wooden boards, the repaired buildings, and the faces of people who had endured hardship, yet now moved with cautious optimism. Holloway paused atop the courthouse steps, looking out over Copperbend. For the first time in many years, he felt fully present, fully alive, not a ghost lingering in the margins, but a man capable of shaping the world around him. Tala stepped beside him, her expression serene yet strong. "The worst is over," she said softly. Holloway nodded, a rare, small smile tugging at his lips. He could not erase the past, could not forget the scars borne by himself or others, but he could ensure that the future held justice and hope. The pair walked down the steps together, blending seamlessly into the townspeople who had once feared both the auctioneer's stage and the shadow of Monroe's tyranny. Children waved, merchants nodded, and even those who had once been complicit in the corruption now offered silent acknowledgment of the courage displayed by the two figures who had altered the course of their lives. As the sun dipped fully below the horizon, the sky turned a deep, fiery orange, then faded into the violet of evening. The town, once a place of cruelty and fear, now seemed bathed in the quiet promise of redemption. Holloway and Tala paused at the edge of the street, looking toward the horizon together. There were no chains, no shackles, no specters of betrayal in sight, only the enduring knowledge that justice had been restored and that they had survived to see it. In that calm, golden light, Holloway made a choice. He would accept the position of marshal, not for power, but to ensure that the town remained safe, that tyranny could not return, and that those who suffer would always have someone to stand for them. Tala would remain by his side, not as a prisoner or subordinate, but as his companion, equal in voice and action, ready to face whatever the future held. The wind carried a quiet whisper through Copperbend, rustling the leaves and stirring the dust one last time that day. There was no laughter or cruelty in the air, no cries of desperation, only a profound, serene acknowledgment that even after years of injustice, even after the deepest betrayal, courage, resolve, and human decency could prevail. Holloway and Tala turned toward the horizon together, two figures who had survived the storm, now ready to face the calm that followed. The sun finally set over Copperbend, bathing the town in the warm embrace of evening. Justice had come, hope had returned, and the shadows of the past had given way to a future neither Holloway nor Tala would face alone.